This day is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can find options that fit your budget and potentially lower your bills. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, January 21st, 2017, between 3 and 5 million people participate in marches around the U.S., the largest single-day protests in U.S. history up until that point. They were later surpassed by the George Floyd protests in 2020. And by the way, I'm a little skeptical sometimes when I hear these numbers and these rankings and how you can calculate those things. Maybe that's another episode. But anyway, January 2017, massive protests. I think, folks, you can probably remember this is just after the inauguration, the first inauguration of Donald Trump, and it is the so-called Women's March and a big early moment of resistance to the incoming Trump administration. It was only 8 years ago, but it feels like a long, long time ago. Things felt very different back then, and given how much news there has been over the last 8 years, we've kind of forgotten a lot of what went down on that day and around those moments. So let's revisit another cold post-Trump inauguration day and talk about the Women's March and why there aren't 3 to 5 million people in the street this time around. Here, as always, Nicole Hammer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
We should say we are recording this a couple days before the inauguration. So, we're not going to mention anything that happened this time around for Trump's inauguration. But let's go to 2017. Kellie, you were around? You were watching stuff?
Yeah,
what are your memories?
Way more recent to me.
It feels more recent.
It does not feel that long ago. And maybe that's because this semester I'm teaching Black women's history, and we do a whole we spend a whole week talking about this particular moment.
So
and
remind us how this all kind of came to a head on that post-inauguration day.
Well, yeah. So really it starts social media. I mean, people start going to Facebook, to Twitter, to all of their social spaces and saying, we need to organize, we need a response, we need to get together and march to Washington, D.C. And really, I mean, it's about Trump. It's also about reproductive rights. It's about women's rights wholesale. I mean, everyone was in this moment of feeling like a lot of legislation that had been supportive of women was about to get rolled back. And this was women's way of saying, like, no, not on our watch. We are not in lockstep. We are not in agreement. And so people start to build these coalitions. And one of the things that I think is most remarkable or memorable about this march is the infamous pussy hat. The hats that were knitted to keep people warm. Because listen, it's January. It's cold in Washington, D.C. I've been to the inauguration before. It's freezing. But also to show like women's productive rights and a stand in solidarity. And there is a sea, and I mean a sea of pink, similar to what you would see like at a breast cancer, awareness event.
But people are knitting them, right, on their own. And that's a big one. I mean, It's like, what was the election? Was November 8th? November 9th, people were out there starting to knit their hats for the protest.
Yes.
Because I think we have to put this in the context of what a blow it was to not just have the first woman nominated by one of the two major parties lose the election while winning the popular vote. Somewhat unexpectedly, because she had been leading in the polls. But also, it was only a month prior from the election when the Access Hollywood tape dropped. Yeah. And Trump had been credibly accused of a number of sexual assaults, some of which he has been held liable for by the courts since. And as a woman in the United States, that it seemed like that didn't matter. I mean, these are the seeds of the Me Too movement. Why it takes off as a national movement. Obviously, there were earlier predecessors to it, but this sense that women's bodily autonomy and sexual safety didn't matter. People were enraged and there was and scared, and there was nowhere for that to go. And then the day after the election, this Facebook page launches, and people are just like, "Here's a place I can go."
Yeah,
and I think that's a big part of why you get this swell of support.
And the pussy hat, I think, is a little bit of a reaction to the MAGA hat, so there's some sort of politics and dynamics there. But clearly women's rights, women's reproductive rights have been one of the defining. But, I'm a little struck by just how immediately everyone kind of knew the score. And this shows like everyone saw where this was headed, right? These were the defining issues of every subsequent election, basically. And that was sort of mobilizing issues especially for Democrats in every subsequent election. And it was right there from day one.
And I think it's worth calling attention to textile art as a kind of resistance that's associated with women, right? Like knitting is seen as a very feminine activity, and to be able to turn that into a tool of resistance was part of the reason that you get this Pussy Hat Project, is because it's a chance to use that hobby that's so tied to femininity and turn it into a political project.
But knitting also has a lot of other sort of intellectual benefits. I mean, I just gave a talk last night and a woman was like, I want you to know I'm not being disrespectful. I'm going to knit during your talk, but like it's so that I can move my hands. And I was like, I completely understand. Like my kids need fidgets and they're paying attention to me, but they have these little spinners and these little things to move while they're trying to keep their hands busy while also actively listening or paying attention to what's happening. But I mean, it's funny to me that it causes sort of like a knitting shortage, like a yarn shortage. Like there's so many hats that are being produced that something similar happened actually when the Barbie movie came out. They're like the pink dye was like a shortage all around the world. Yeah.
People would have just, dusted those pussy hats out of the closet.
I know.
Barbie. Or broken them down and remade them into Barbie stuff.
Yeah. Quite a symbolic journey.
Quite a symbolic journey, indeed. Other little tidbits from that day. I mean, first, it's worth pointing out that, like, there are often protests on Inauguration Day or the day after. I mean, I went to high school in D.C. I always went to the inauguration the few times I was down there, and there were always kind of counter-protests and so forth. But this was at a whole nother scale. I think that, obviously, like, this was a key moment, I think, that just showed both to Trump and the MAGA movement, but also, I think, to Democrats who were like crestfallen, that there is a little mobilization to be had, a little resistance to be had. I mean, it was a kind of wake-up call. And I think people saw the images from all around the country. People saw the signs. I mean, I remember being struck that a lot of the signs were funny, and I just think that's such an important part of any movement, that there needs to be like humor and a cultural element to it as well as politics and policy. And so I just think that, like, after a month of mourning, if you're a Democrat, people found that kind of groove of like, yeah, we can stick up for ourselves and we can have a little quote unquote fun doing it. Yeah.
I do think it's interesting because like and this is also an image that I use in my class where it's of a black woman and she's sort of sucking on a lollipop and has a poster that says, like, don't forget, overwhelmingly white women voted for Trump. Like, I didn't do this. Like, this is not my problem. And I know, just talking from a lot of other black friends and colleagues, so I was like, hey, are you going to D.C.? And they're like, no, I'm not going to D.C. And I was like, why not? And they're like, because I didn't do this. I did my job. And there was a lot of also even backlash about the hats. Like, people were like, well, not all pussies are pink. Like, how do we make this a more inclusive thing? Or when we talk about these issues, overwhelmingly women's issues become white women's issues. And so how do you like shift this into a conversation that includes all women? And so there's that legacy as well of like those divisions, and those divisions are old. That's not new at all. You could take that back to the 19th century in terms of white women and black women and wealthy women and poor women and how they divide along ideological lines. But that was something that I remember popping up as well.
Have you ever had the urge to sneak behind the cordoned off areas of a museum? Or roam the halls after closing time? The Smithsonian's flagship podcast, Side Door, will sneak you behind the scenes of the world's largest museum and research complex. Come learn about the ghosts that supposedly walk the museum halls after dark, how a train robbery gave rise to criminal forensics, why leeches are actually the coolest thing ever, and how to get away with murder in the Arctic. Maybe. You'll discover stories of history, science, art, and culture you won't find in a display case. You can listen to Side Door wherever you get your podcasts. or find us online at si.edu/sidedoor.
Look, I know it's a bit of a cliche to make a New Year's resolution to save more money. Probably even more of a cliche that resolution rarely gets kept. Honestly, I don't know when you're listening to this, but chances are I have already broken like 4 of my New Year's resolutions. But the saving more money one, it has been a lot easier for me thanks to Mint Mobile. I switched over to Mint Mobile's premium wireless service a couple months ago, and it has put some real wind in my sails going into 2025. Because their plans start at just $15 a month when you purchase a 3-month plan. Switching over from one of the big 3 carriers was incredibly easy, and boom, just like that, saving. I'm on my way. You can be on your way to fulfilling that resolution to spend less. To get this new customer offer and your new 3-month unlimited wireless plan for just $15 a month, go to mintmobile.com/thisday. That's mintmobile.com/thisday. Cut your wireless bill to $15 a month at mintmobile.com/thisday. $45 upfront payment required, equivalent to $15 a month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes on unlimited plan. Additional taxes, fees, and restrictions apply. See Mint Mobile for details.
I think, too, on the humor front, for women who were there were these tensions. And there was also like a lot of politics around the organizers,
yes.
Which was particularly intense in right-wing spaces.
There will always be grifters.
Yes. But the women I know who went found it both deeply moving. Like it was a space of joy to be surrounded by so many other women who were committed to the same political action, and also like a turning point in their political awareness and activism. Like so many of the people who were at the march went home and they signed up with our local Indivisible branch. Some of them ran for office. Like they found it to be a starting point for deeper, long-term political engagement. It wasn't just a one-off, one-day thing. It was the start of something for a lot of people who were there.
Yeah. And that, I will say, is how, when Kamala had her run, there was a lot of like, remember 2017? We're going to get this right. Like, we're going to like try to correct some of the errors, correct some of the, the things that didn't go so well, and try to use this next moment or movement to repair some of that.
And it worked. And
I know. I was like, also wonderfully successful.
I'm looking at some of the photos of the signs from that day, and there are a lot of people who are like, yeah, I don't normally protest, but come on, and like people are sort of, you're right that there was a sort of mobilization and activation for a lot of people, and then there were signs that like, remember those like Melania blink twice for help signs, or, orange is the new whack. That was a good one. But look, Kellie, I want to return to your point about the kind of racial makeup here, the demographic, the sort of cultural makeup around this march, because I think it both points out, I think, some of the sort of ongoing, longstanding issues that often the left coalition has to deal with. But I also think it was the place that opened up a movement like this to a level of cultural mockery or dismissal. And, Niki, you're the one who sort of watches these right-wing spaces. But the Women's March became galvanizing for a lot of white women on the left, and it became an absolute, like, touchstone of dismissal and mockery from MAGA world. In particular, there's like those memes of the women who are crying out and, over emoting or whatever. And so kind of it provides fodder for that, in a way, that backlash, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Not all. I mean, when we were talking about, was it Phyllis Schlafly? Not all women are going to be in support. I mean, I also saw women at Trump rallies with posters that said, "He can grab me by the peony time." You are always going to have women who will not be in support of the larger goal. And I think that sometimes we think those numbers are smaller, or maybe like just a few people that are sort of fringe. But I don't know. I think those numbers are actually a little bit larger than we think because patriarchy is such that all of us have been impacted and programmed to think in a certain way about women. And if we're not careful, you can internalize those beliefs as well.
And it's also like no protest movement can get it right. Like there is no perfect protest. And so you're going to get all of this. I actually think that the Women's March was an important political activism and organizational moment. I think the George Floyd protests were an enormous moment of political activism and a real change for how some people thought about politics. And the abuse heaped on both of those protests in misogynistic ways for the Women's March and racist ways for the protests in support of George Floyd. Like, you can't win for losing. Like, there's nothing you can do about it. So you just got to go out there and share your message and make your points. And the backlash is always coming because actually the backlash was there before you were.
Right.
So
it's
all you can do.
It's going to be there no matter what, right? So let's hold that thought for 1 second because I think that brings us to some questions about now and what resistance and backlash will look like over the next 4 years. But just to kind of tie up a couple things from that day itself, the Women's March. About 230 people are arrested in D.C. They have a little nickname for a while, the J20 protesters. It all kind of falls apart. Nothing really comes of it. There's another sort of little thing that comes out of it, which is that is the march where that guy Richard Spencer, who Niki knows quite well, not personally, but that the neo-Nazi Richard Spencer is punched during an interview in DC streets, and it breaks out into this whole kind of like, should you punch a Nazi? Is it okay to punch a Nazi thing on social media?
Answer is yes.
Fair enough. This is a much, much bigger thing, but I'm, thinking about differences between now and then. I mean, I'm just struck by how much kind of like no one would go to Facebook now to organize something like this or Twitter now to organize something like this. So it's just kind of like a little marker of how much those spaces have shifted. And so as we start to think about the shift to now and why we are likely not seeing, these kinds of protests on the street now as Trump is once again inaugurated. It's funny, and I think this connects, but like when I think about early Trump moments of resistance, I've said this on the show before, but the one for me that just lands and sticks out and really cut through was not necessarily the Women's March, but a few weeks later, there was the moment at JFK Airport where the Muslim ban had been enacted and people were getting off planes at JFK and hundreds of lawyers showed up at JFK to advise Muslim immigrants. And that was the moment where it just, it moved me. It kind of made me realize like lawyers are the ones that are going to save us, But it also just felt like there's this very concrete, very on the ground, very tangible thing. And the Women's March, for all the reasons you described, Niki, was incredibly important in terms of galvanizing a movement and sending a message. And there's power in that. But I also think there's just deep power in like fighting at every front, and fighting on a specific front. And, my sense is that there is still a huge resistance movement to Trump out there now. But if there's a change between now and 8 years ago, it's more like we're just going to have to dig in and battle kind of at every juncture with lawyers, much more than we're going to have these mass protests. And I'm just curious what you make of that shift, or if that's even the kind of way you see the shift.
I see the shift that way. I mean, we talked on our day after the election conversation about that the idea that there wasn't going to be a second Women's March, right? That the kind of symbolic politics were probably done for a while, and people were going to turn to their communities and figure out how to secure their communities and make people safe and give people the aid they need. Something that was frankly prefigured by the work that's been done to help women access abortion in states where it's been outlawed, right? Like you need that immediate on the ground work. And that actually might be, that and the airport protests might actually be really good examples of how activism and expertise are going to operate during the Trump era, because we're not talking about, as we were on January 21st, the potential harms that could happen. We're already knee deep in the harms that happened because of the first Trump administration. And people, I think, are sort of girding themselves for what comes next. And again, like, I think it's going to be this very practical set of actions in order to safeguard as many people as possible.
Yeah. I mean, the optimist in me agrees. Like, the optimist in me thinks, yes, small little solutions, chip away at the problem, tackle it in the area that you can, sort of have like a micro way of getting at some of these solutions and protecting people. And then, I don't know, there's like the historian in me that feels like people are tired, that feels like there's a lot of anticipatory obedience happening, like people just getting in lockstep before they've even got into the battlefield, you know? And that is what like discourages me more than anything, feeling like people are like, well, we lived through this before, let's just see. And so I don't know, I have talked about sort of like how protests can be insufficient, how they can feel very symbolic, and that can feel kind of deflating afterwards when you feel like, well, what was the major legislation, or what was the policy, or what were the major sort of changes that come after that? I think people start to feel like it's more performative than it is like powerful. So I don't know. I think we need to mix it up. I think it's going to have to look different, and that's okay. And it's not that protests don't work. I just think that we need more tools, more strategies.
Right. Yeah, and I think it's largely still an open question. I mean, we're here on the first day of the second Trump administration. And I think, the question in my head is not why wasn't there another women's march, but it's more, when will there be the next JFK airport protest? That's the moment I'm watching for, the very concrete, ICE agents show up and then what kind of question. And so we'll see. But it is certainly a changed environment. All right. Well, we will leave it there. Our first episode of the new Trump era. Nicole Hammer, thanks to you as always.
Thanks, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
We got this. Keep on coming. Woo!
They shouted. And they waved every insult they could muster.
This is what democracy looks like.
Pink pussycaps, mocking Trump for comments he's made about women, reinforced in as many ways they could think of. Hundreds of thousands of Americans enraged by the man voted into office by millions of other Americans.
My message to him is listen to your people. You want to be the president of all of us? Listen to your people.
Radiotopia. From